She held up a hand, a pained look on her face that was more about her own embarrassment than my feelings. Her husband, Mark, stood behind her, his arms crossed, a silent, judgmental statue in a pressed polo shirt. "Dad, please," she'd whispered, her voice urgent as she glanced at the neighbor's window. "Not in that dirty jumpsuit. The neighbors will see." Her words weren't a hammer blow, they were 1,000 tiny needles, each one finding a place deep inside me. I looked down at my clothes, at the fabric that represented my life's work, my sacrifice. This jumpsuit had bought the books, the tuition, the goddamn cobblestones she was standing on, and it was an embarrassment. "Your dirty jumpsuit is embarrassing," she'd said, her voice rising with a frantic edge when I didn't immediately retreat. "Just go home, change, and come back. Please." I just stood there, the small toolbox I'd brought for Leo, a toy one to match mine, feeling impossibly heavy in my hand. I looked past her, hoping to see my grandson, but she shifted, blocking the view. I was being hidden. Me, her father. I turned without a word and walked back to my truck, the scent of her manicured lawns and blooming roses choking me. The silence in my workshop was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders and filling my ears with a dull roar that was louder than any engine I'd ever fixed. I sank onto the worn wooden stool, its familiar groans a pathetic echo of my own. The phone, that sleek little slab of glass and lies, now lay inert on my workbench, a discarded artifact from a civilization I no longer understood. The anger I expected to feel, the righteous fire I thought would burn in my chest, wasn't there. Instead, there was a hollowed-out emptiness, a cavern inside me where my pride used to live. I stared at my hands, really looked at them. They were tools, not things of beauty. The skin was a roadmap of scars and calluses, a leathery testament to 50 years of honest work. The nails were permanently rimmed with a black that soap and scrubbing couldn't touch, the knuckles swollen and slightly crooked from years of gripping wrenches and absorbing impacts. These were the hands that had cradled Sarah when she was a baby, so small her whole body fit in my palms. These fingers had fixed the chain on her first pink bicycle, had tightened the training wheels while she watched with wide, trusting eyes. This right hand, with its permanently chapped knuckle, had shaken the dean's hand as I handed over a check for her final semester's tuition. Now, they were a source of shame. Dirty. Unacceptable. The sting of her words came back, not as a single blow, but as a persistent low-grade fever. I could still see the frantic look in her eyes, the way she'd glanced at the neighbor's window as if I were a predator. I was her father. I'd taught her how to swim, for God's sake. I'd sat up with her all night when she had the flu, reading her Charlotte's Web until my voice was hoarse. And now, my very presence was something to be hidden, a dirty secret to be managed. I looked around the workshop. This wasn't just a garage. It was my sanctuary, the archive of my life. The scent of oil, gasoline, and old wood was as familiar to me as my own breath. On the wall hung a faded, finger-painted masterpiece on construction paper, a mess of purple and green that was supposed to be a truck, given to me by a 4-year-old Sarah for Father's Day. "To the best fixer, Daddy." It read in my late wife's handwriting, with Sarah's wobbly signature below. I'd framed it. It had hung in every workshop I'd ever had. My eyes fell on the small red toy toolbox I'd brought for Leo. I'd spent last week in here, after closing up the shop, carefully sanding down the rough edges, painting it the same fire engine red as my own. I'd even found tiny functional hinges and a latch. It was empty, waiting for me to fill it with toy wrenches and plastic screws, so he could help his grandpa. It felt impossibly heavy now, a monument to a connection that was being systematically severed. I questioned every single 16-hour day, every weekend I'd spent buried under a hood instead of pushing her on a swing. I remembered the vacation to Disney World we'd skipped because the bank account was looking thin and her college fund needed feeding. Carol had been so disappointed, but Sarah, she'd just hugged my leg and said, "It's okay, Daddy. The Magic Kingdom will still be there." I'd promised her we'd go the next year. We never did. There was always another transmission to rebuild, another tuition payment due. I had traded those moments, those memories, for a future I believed in. A future where my daughter would have choices I never had. And the grand, cruel joke of it all was that the future had arrived, and in it I was an embarrassment. The very grime under my fingernails, the very essence of the labor that had bought her that future, was the thing that made me unfit for it. A hot, sharp pressure built behind my eyes. I hadn't cried since Carol's funeral. I'd been a rock then for Sarah. I'd held her while she sobbed. I'd made the arrangements. I'd been the strong one. Now, sitting alone in the quiet company of my tools, the strength was gone. A single traitorous tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the dust on my cheek. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the erasure. She wasn't just asking me to change my clothes, she was asking me to change my skin, to shed the history written on my hands and in the lines of my face. She wanted the result of my labor, the successful daughter, the educated woman in the nice house, without the messy, greasy man who made it all possible. I reached out and picked up a heavy, 12-inch adjustable wrench from the bench. The cold, solid weight of it was a comfort. This, I understood. This had purpose. It could loosen what was stuck, tighten what was loose. It could fix things. But there was no tool in this shop, no amount of grit or grease-stained ingenuity that could fix the broken thing inside me. The memory of her perfect world still felt like it was choking me, even here, a world away, surrounded by the only things that had ever made sense. My gaze drifted across the organized chaos of my shop and landed on a faded photograph tacked to the corkboard. It was me, maybe 20 years old, standing next to my own father. We were both grinning, covered in grease, our arms slung over each other's shoulders in front of the '68 Mustang we had spent a year rebuilding. We were wearing the same kind of blue jumpsuits. My dad's voice echoed in my memory, as clear as if he were standing right next to me. "Some folks only see the shine, Frankie," he used to say, wiping his hands on a rag just like the one in my hand now. "But the real story is in the engine, and some engines, son, some are designed to fail from the start." The words echoed, twisting and turning in my mind until they weren't about engines anymore. They were about me. Had I been designed to fail? Was this my inevitable, preordained breakdown? I had poured every ounce of myself into being a good provider, a solid foundation. I thought I was building something permanent, something that would outlast me. But maybe my father, in his grease-stained wisdom, had seen the truth. Maybe the foundation itself was flawed, the very material I was made of. The grit, the sweat, the stubborn pride in a hard day's work was the crack that would eventually split everything wide open. I looked down at my hands, the skin permanently etched with black lines, the nails short and blunt. These hands had cradled my infant daughter, had held my wife as she took her last breath, had built a life from nothing but determination and calluses. The realization was a cold blade. Her rejection wasn't a simple argument. It was a fundamental repudiation of my entire existence. A fresh wave of that choking sensation, the scent of her roses and clean laundry, threatened to overwhelm the familiar, comforting smells of oil and metal. I squeezed the wrench until my knuckles ached, a desperate anchor to the tangible world. This was real. This steel, this grime, this quiet sanctuary of my own making. Out there, in her world, everything was soft surfaces and unspoken rules, a place where value was measured by the absence of effort, not the evidence of it. My eyes found the photograph again, zeroing in on my father's face. He hadn't been an educated man, but he had a PhD in the physics of reality. He knew that pressure, over time, would find the weakest point. He knew that a cheap gasket would always blow before a forged piston. I thought of Sarah's husband, Mark. His handshake was always a little too quick, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He was all shine, a polished exterior with a soft, untested core. He talked about leveraging assets and optimizing outcomes, words that felt as hollow as a rusted-out muffler. And then it hit me. A jolt so visceral I almost dropped the wrench. The memory of my father's words wasn't just a nostalgic pang or a lesson in mechanics. It was a diagnosis. The last time I was at Sarah's house, a month ago, Mark had proudly shown me his new German sedan. A marvel of engineering, he'd said, patting the hood like it was a show dog. I'd nodded, but my eyes had been drawn to the faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of blue smoke from the exhaust on a cold start. Just a wisp, gone in a second. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but I did. I saw it because I was trained to see it. Worn valve guides. A costly repair. A design flaw common in that model, something a real enthusiast would have known about. Mark wasn't an enthusiast. He was a consumer. He bought the badge, the prestige, the flawless gleaming surface. He didn't hear the faint, expensive tick-tick-tick of a timing chain that was just a little too loose, but I had. I'd heard it as clearly as I now heard my father's voice. I had said nothing, of course. It wasn't my place. My place was to be the embarrassing relic who didn't know which fork to use, not the oracle who could predict the $4,000 repair bill lurking in his son-in-law's near future. The irony was so perfect it was painful. There I was, the unrefined mechanic, seeing the fatal flaw in the centerpiece of his refined life. He was driving a ticking time bomb, convinced of his own superiority, while he looked down on the one man who could have told him how to fix it. A grim, humorless smile touched my lips. This was the grand, cruel joke my life had become. My daughter had married a man who was, by my father's definition, an engine designed to fail. A pretty shell with substandard parts. And she had chosen his world over mine. She had chosen the shine. I placed the wrench back on the bench with a soft, definitive clink. The tear was gone, wiped away along with the last vestiges of my self-pity. The broken thing inside me was still there, a jagged piece of shrapnel lodged in my soul, but it was no longer a weakness. It was a lens. It had clarified my vision. I saw the lines of fracture not just in metal, but in lives. I saw the hidden weaknesses, the compromises, the cheap parts people use to build their facades. My value wasn't in my ability to blend into Sarah's world. It was in my ability to see right through it. The grime under my nails wasn't a stain. It was the residue of truth. The proof that I had touched the real, unvarnished workings of the world. They could keep their manicured lawns and their silent, judgmental rooms. I had my shop. I had my tools. And I had the one thing they had desperately tried to engineer out of their lives, the undeniable, uncomfortable, and essential knowledge of how things break. And more importantly, why? The hollowness inside me began to fill with something else, a cold, hard resolve. The shame curdled into a quiet fury. That car wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of everything that had pushed my daughter away from me. Her husband Mark's arrogance, the obsession with appearances, the belief that paying for something was the same as understanding it. I decided in that moment that I wouldn't just be her roadside assistance. I would use the very knowledge she despised to teach them a lesson about value, about integrity, and about the man they thought was just an embarrassing old mechanic in a dirty jumpsuit. My fight wouldn't be loud or angry, it would be silent, precise, and absolute. The plan didn't form as a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, meticulous assembly of parts, like rebuilding an engine from a bare block. I wouldn't sabotage the car. That would be crude, and worse, it would be dangerous for Sarah. No, my intervention would be far more elegant. I would let the machine follow its own flawed destiny. I would simply be the one to guide it to its inevitable conclusion, on my terms, in my arena. The opportunity presented itself a week later, a phone call that felt less like a ringtone and more like a curtain rising on my stage. It was Sarah, her voice tight with that particular strain of frustration reserved for first-world inconveniences. "Dad, the BMW, it's making a noise," a kind of whirring, grinding sound from the front. "Mark says it's probably nothing, but it's getting worse." I could hear the silent negotiation in her breathing. the reluctance to involve me warring with the fear of a hefty dealership bill. The dealership, where they charged $100 just to diagnose the air you breathed in the waiting room. "Could you look at it?" she finally asked, the words dragged out of her. "Bring it by the shop tomorrow morning," I said. "Early, before the day gets busy." "Mark, Sarah," I gave my daughter a small, tight smile. She looked out of place, a delicate flower in a greenhouse of steel and rubber. I didn't wait. I put the car on the lift, the hydraulic whir a familiar song. I moved with a practiced, deliberate slowness. I wanted them to watch. I wanted Mark to see the confidence in my hands, the intimate knowledge I had of this complex, expensive toy he barely understood. I started with the front end, checking the wheel bearings. They were fine, of course. I made a show of it, tapping, spinning, listening with my stethoscope. I then moved to the transmission, humming thoughtfully, but my real target was further back. I finally positioned my light on the underbelly of the transfer case. I reached up, and with a single gloved finger, wiped a specific spot. I held my finger up to the light, showing them the fine, glittering metallic dust clinging to the nitrile, the fairy dust of impending mechanical doom. "There's your noise," I said, my voice flat. "Metal-on-metal contact inside the transfer case. The bearings are eating themselves. See that?" I pointed to a barely perceptible seep of fluid. "It's starting to weep. It's only a matter of time before it locks up solid, or it could seize entirely, which would likely take out the transmission and the drive shaft with it. Catastrophic failure." I stood in the doorway of my shop, my arms crossed, as they climbed into their second car, a silent, tense capsule of anxiety. I watched them leave, the grime of my shop a shield against their polished world. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah. Her voice was small, defeated. "The dealer just called. They confirmed it. The transfer case is failing. They quoted $4,200. She let out a shaky breath. "You were right, Dad." "How did you know?" It was the sound of a lesson delivered, not with a shout, but with the quiet, undeniable authority of a truth they could no longer ignore. The first move was complete. The pretty shell had cracked, and for the first time I believed they might actually be able to hear the ticking from the inside. I just grunted, wiping my hands on a rag, the scent of high-end cologne he'd left on my shirt, a ghost of a world I'd rejected. My gut, an instrument tuned by decades of spotting shoddy repairs and counterfeit parts, had clenched into a cold, hard knot. A killer deal. In my world, there was no such thing. After their tense departure, the silence they left behind was a different substance. It was charged, potent. I stood for a long moment in the center of the shop, the familiar sense of grease, gasoline, and old concrete filling my lungs like a tonic. The cold resolve that had been my anchor for months now felt less like ice and more like focused steel. They had seen the crack in their perfect world. Now I needed to show them the fault line it ran along. I walked to the old desktop computer in the corner, a monolithic tower covered in a fine film of dust and a few greasy fingerprints. It whirred to life, with a sound like a dying lawnmower, the CRT monitor blooming to life in a slow, agonizing curve of light. I didn't open a browser to search for financial records or business registries. That was Mark's territory, the world of clean, easily manipulated numbers. I went to the places I knew, the digital back alleys and greasy spoons of my trade, the online forums for mechanics, the obscure message boards for disgruntled owners and shade tree gearheads. The digital scent was the same as my shop, a little bitter, unfiltered, and brutally honest. I started with the model of Sarah's car. A specific engine code I'd memorized when I'd first lifted its hood and felt that first faint tremor of wrongness. The hits started to pile up, not in the thousands, but in a focused, damning cluster. Stories of premature failure, of a specific whine that started just outside the warranty period, of a catastrophic shudder under acceleration. The language was technical, laced with the frustration of people who knew how things should work and were furious at how they'd been made to fail. And then I saw the pattern, emerging from the digital noise like a signature. It wasn't every car of that model. It was a subset, a batch, And the trail, again and again, led back to the same point of origin. Prestige Motors, or more precisely, Alistair Finch's entire chain of dealerships, Apex Auto Collection, Elite Imports, all names designed to appeal to a certain aspiration. I fell down the rabbit hole, the blue glow of the monitor the only light in the darkening shop. I cross-referenced usernames, compared failure mileages, read between the lines of furious typed rants. These weren't people who'd neglected their vehicles. They were doctors, engineers, small business owners, people like Mark, who believed in the sanctity of a brand name and the finality of a signed contract. They'd all been charmed by Finch, disarmed by his polished pitch and the gleaming facade of his lots. They'd all gotten a killer deal. Transfer case is the obvious failure, but the root cause is shoddy remanufacturing. The internal gears are being machined with a tolerance so loose a gnat could fly through it. It's not a manufacturing defect. It's a manufacturing choice. Cheap parts, dressed in expensive paint, sell a beautiful lie. Let it run just long enough to get the buyer invested, and then let nature, the brutal, unforgiving nature of physics and inferior metal, take its course. The $4,200 repair bill wasn't a misfortune. It was a calculated return on investment. I leaned back in the creaking swivel chair, the facts settling into place with the satisfying click of a well-seated bearing. Alistair Finch wasn't just a shark. He was an engineer. He engineered desire, he engineered a deal, and most crucially, he engineered the failure. He knew exactly how long the pretty shell would hold before the ticking within became a roar. My phone sat silent on the desk next to me. Sarah's defeated voice still echoed in the quiet. "You were right, Dad." She thought the lesson was about a car, about my mechanical prowess versus the dealer's incompetence. She had no idea that the car was just the primer, the first small explosive charge used to breach the hull. The real lesson was waiting in the wings. It was about the Alistair Finches of the world, the smiling faces who built their fortunes on planned obsolescence, not of machines, but of trust itself. Mark and Sarah lived in that world. They played by its rules, and they had no idea they were the product being sold. I had just handed them a bill for $4,000. Soon, I would show them the man who had sent it. And then, they would have to decide what kind of currency they were really willing to use to pay their debts. The next morning, I called Sal, a grizzled old-timer who used to be a state vehicle inspector before retiring. He owed me a favor after I'd rebuilt the transmission on his vintage pickup for a case of beer. I told him my suspicions about the car and Finch's dealership. Sal's dislike for corporate con artists was even greater than mine. He spent a few hours cross-referencing industry service bulletins and confidential dealer memos. He called me back that afternoon, his voice grim. "Frankie, you hit the jackpot," he said. "There's a known defect in the timing chain on that model. It's not a recall yet, but the manufacturer knows. A guy like Finch could buy them cheap, sell them fast, and deny everything when they blow up. He had found my smoking gun. But a smoking gun is useless unless you know exactly who to point it at." Sal's information was the what, the technical validation of the lie. But I needed the how. I needed to understand the mechanism of the deceit, the cold, precise engineering of the swindle. Alistair Finch wasn't some back-alley hustler hawking fake Rolexes. He was a master craftsman of fraud, and I needed to appreciate his artistry before I could dismantle it. I spent the rest of the day in the garage, not fixing anything, just thinking. The scent of oil and gasoline was my incense, the hum of the fluorescent light my meditation chant. I pulled up the service history Sarah had forwarded from the dealership. It was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. Every visit was documented with benign, routine work. Tire rotations, fluid top-offs, software updates. The language was sterile, designed to bore you into submission. But buried in the jargon, I saw the pattern. A drive cycle verification at 12,000 miles. An engine acoustical analysis at 18,000. They were listening just as I had suspected. They were monitoring the ticking time bomb in their own product, logging its progress toward the inevitable expensive crescendo. They weren't just selling a faulty car. They were selling a subscription to its eventual failure. That evening, I drove to the edge of the city, to a sterile business park that housed Finch's dealership. It was closed, the lot empty save for a few loaner vehicles. The building was all gleaming glass and polished steel, a temple of commerce. I didn't get out. I just sat in my old truck, its engine a symphony of honest, predictable clatter, and watched. I saw the security cameras, the motion-activated lights, the perfectly manicured shrubs. It was a fortress of legitimacy. And then I saw him, Alistair Finch. He emerged from a side door, not in a flashy suit, but in a tailored, understated overcoat. He walked with the calm, unhurried gait of a man who owned not just the building, but the very ground it stood on. He stopped by a sleek, silver sedan, the same model as Sarah's, but a higher trim. He didn't get in. He simply ran a hand over the roof, a gesture that wasn't affectionate, but proprietary. It was the touch of a farmer checking the quality of his crop. He knew this one was different. This one was built with better parts for a different class of customer. A customer like him. Watching him, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't a man cutting corners to save a buck. This was a man with a philosophy. He believed the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who engineered systems and those who were processed by them. He sold beautiful, shiny traps to the latter, and he did it with a smile because he genuinely believed it was their place to be caught. The $4,200 repair wasn't a bill. It was an IQ test, a tax on hope and ignorance. I drove home, my mind clearer than it had been in weeks. I had the what from Sal, and now I understood the how and the why. The next step was to make Mark and Sarah see it. They couldn't just be told, they had to be shown. They needed to feel the cold, calculated intent behind the warm handshake. The following day, I invited them over for dinner, specifically asking them to leave the Finch mobile at home. Sarah arrived tense, expecting another "I told you so" lecture. Mark was quiet, defensive, the phantom weight of that repair bill hanging between us like a ghost. After we ate, I didn't bring up the car. Instead, I led them down to my basement workshop. On my heavy wooden workbench, laid out on a clean shop towel like surgical instruments, were the failed parts from Sarah's car. The fractured timing chain guide, the scored camshaft sprockets. Next to them, I placed the new upgraded parts I had installed, the ones that should have been in the car from the factory. "Look at this," I said, my voice quiet, not with anger, but with a grim reverence. I picked up the broken guide. "See this plastic? It's cheap. It's designed to become brittle with heat and time." I pointed to the metal sprocket. "And this alloy? It's soft. It's designed to wear. These two parts," I said, tapping them together. "They aren't just defective, they're incompatible by design. One is the hammer, the other is the glass." Mark's face shifted from defensiveness to a slow, dawning horror. He was a man who lived in a world of spreadsheets and projections. He understood the language of cost-benefit analysis. He was finally seeing the spreadsheet Finch had built, with my daughter's trust and their financial security listed neatly in the liability column. Sarah stared at the broken parts, her fingers tracing the fracture line on the plastic guide. "He knew," she whispered, the words hanging in the dusty air of the workshop. When he shook my hand and said congratulations, he knew this was inside the engine. Now they were staring into the dark, engineered heart of the ship, and they could see the man standing at the controls, smiling. "You're right," I said. He knew. So now, the question isn't about the car anymore. The question is, what are you going to do about the man who sold you the lie? Mark and Sarah weren't just looking at broken car parts anymore. They were looking at the shattered pieces of a promise. Mark broke first. He let out a short, sharp breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. It was the sound of a man realizing he'd been meticulously counting pennies while someone was stealing the entire vault. "The liability column," he repeated, his voice hollow. He sat across from us at that mahogany table with the panoramic view of the city, and he talked about legacy, about the Finch family's commitment to quality. He made us feel like we were being welcomed into a club. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, leaving it disheveled. A small, satisfying detail. Sarah's reaction was quieter, more dangerous. She hadn't taken her eyes off the broken plastic guide in her hand. Her thumb kept stroking the sharp, fractured edge back and forth, as if trying to smooth away the inherent flaw. "He knew," she said again, her voice gaining a steely core. He looked me in the eye, shook my hand, and said, "Sarah, you're not just buying a car, you're buying peace of mind." She finally looked up, and her gaze was pure, undiluted clarity. He was so specific, so reassuring. That wasn't a sales pitch, it was a performance. This wasn't a moment for me to lecture. They were connecting the dots on their own, and my job was just to hold the map. I picked up a clean shop rag and started methodically wiping the grease from my fingers. The simple, honest action was a stark contrast to the engineered deception laid out on the bench. "It's not just your car," I said, my voice low. I walked over to a filing cabinet, its drawers scarred and stained with decades of use, and pulled out a thick, dog-eared folder. I dropped it on the bench with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the quiet space. "This is the Chronicle, the Vanguard Apex S-Type, 2022 model year." I opened it, revealing a chaos of my own handwritten notes, printed forum threads, and service invoices. "I've been building this since the first one showed up on a tow truck 2 years ago, a month out of warranty, with a seized engine and a very confused owner who'd just had it in for its 15,000-mile complimentary checkup." Here were frantic messages from online forums, users with screen names like Apex Anxious and Vanguard Victim, all describing the same phantom power loss, the same terrifying engine shudder, the same final, expensive silence. "They all have the same story," I said, tapping a photo of a smiling couple, their now useless car being loaded onto a flatbed behind them. They were all told it was a 1-in-a-million fluke, a bad sensor, a software glitch. They were made to feel unlucky. But look, I pointed to the service bulletin on my tablet. The cold corporate language I'd shown them earlier. Finch Motors knew it wasn't a fluke. They tracked the failure rate. They knew the conditions that accelerated it. They had a timeline. This, I swept my hand over the folder, wasn't an accident. It was a calculated actuarial decision. "So what was the calculation?" he asked, the spreadsheet man re-emerging, now weaponized. "What was the break-even point? The repair cost is more than most of the car's residual value at that point. It's a total write-off for the owner. For Finch, it's a closed ledger. They've already been paid. And my daughter's trust, her future, was the sweetener to make sure you didn't ask too many questions when you bought it. This is a case for a lawyer. We need to think differently. Not to start an engine, but to dismantle an entire empire, one lie at a time. The question isn't about the car anymore. It's about how many other people are driving around with a glass heart and a smiling hammer poised to fall, where actual professionals can fix it, not in this backyard operation. What would a guy who still uses wrenches from the Stone Age know about a 2025 import?" The sneer in his voice was a physical thing, a slap delivered from a safe distance. "They sold us the car, Frank. They have the parts, the technology, the expertise. You have a leaky hydraulic lift and a grudge." He was so blinded by the brand name, the gleaming white showroom with its potted orchids and barista-staffed coffee bar, that he was willingly delivering the evidence, the entire damning, ticking vehicle, right back into the lion's den. I could almost picture the smooth, practiced smiles of the prestige service manager, the way they'd usher him into a plush waiting area, a latte placed in his hand, while they quietly, efficiently dismantled the proof. "Fine, Mark," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the argument he was so clearly itching for. "You do what you think is best." I ended the call before he could get another jab in, the silence of the garage rushing back in, feeling more like a held breath than an absence of sound. I looked over at Sarah's old project, the skeletal frame of a vintage motorcycle we'd been restoring together. It was all honest work. Every stripped bolt, every painstakingly cleaned carburetor jet. It was all truth. What Finch Automotive was doing, it was a perversion. They weren't building machines, they were building dependencies, crafting beautiful high-tech traps. The next 48 hours were a study in forced patience. I cleaned tools that were already spotless. I reorganized my stockroom. I waited. I knew the sequence of events as if I'd written the script myself. The tow to Prestige. The initial, complimentary, courtesy inspection. The inevitable concerned call to Mark and Helen about unforeseen complications and deeper system faults. The carefully worded offer of a goodwill gesture from the manufacturer to cover the highly unusual failure, an offer contingent on their discretion. The call, when it finally came, wasn't from Mark. It was from Sarah. Her voice was raw, stripped of its usual polished confidence, a frayed wire sparking in the dark. "They have it," she whispered, as if someone might be listening. "They said the engine has a catastrophic timing failure, that it's a miracle it didn't seize on the highway. They're quoting $18,000, a loaner, a newer model, while they assess the viability of a repair. They said it would be at a significantly reduced lease rate, given the circumstances." She let out a shaky breath. But Frank, the man, the service manager, he was so insistent we signed the work authorization. He had the paperwork ready. It was all full of legal terms, clauses about proprietary technology and confidentiality. They were moving fast, trying to bury this under a mountain of legalese and a shiny new loaner car before the Marks and Helens of the world had a chance to think, to talk to a guy with Stone Age wrenches. "Don't sign anything, Helen. Not a single page. He thinks I'm being paranoid, that I'm listening to the wrong people." I could hear the soft sound of her crying, the quiet, shattered grief of a dream not just broken, but revealed to have been a lie from the very start. "They used Sarah," she finally said, her voice cracking. "They used my little girl's trust to sell us a lemon. Now the real work begins." I looked at the empty bay where the Finch Ethereum would soon sit, not as a symbol of their success, but as the centerpiece of their undoing. The key wasn't for starting it anymore. It was for taking the whole damned thing apart. Immediately after hanging up with Mark, I called Sal. "The fish is taking the bait," I told him. "It's heading back to the dealer." He made a formal, anonymous tip to his old buddies at the Bureau of Automotive Repair, providing the car's VIN, the specific defect to look for, and the name of the dealership about to commit fraud by knowingly concealing it. The trap wasn't just me against them anymore. Now, it was a state-level investigation waiting for the dealership to make its move. I paced the length of the garage, the gritty concrete floor a familiar comfort against the soles of my boots. The air, thick with the smells of old oil, gasoline, and metal shavings, was my element. It was honest. You could see the grime, feel the heft of a tool, understand the simple, brutal logic of a seized bolt. Finch Motors operated in a different atmosphere, one of antiseptic showrooms and air laced with the subtle poison of deceit. They didn't sell cars. They sold faith, and they were about to find out what happened when that faith was broken. My phone buzzed. "Helen, they're stalling," she said, her voice a tight wire of anxiety. "The service manager, a Mr. Sterling, says the car is already deep in their diagnostic process, that disconnecting it now could corrupt the vehicle's neural matrix." His words. "What did you say?" It was a relic, filled with tools that had no place near a Finch Ethereum. They were for machines with souls, not silicon brains. But the principle was the same. Find the weakness, apply pressure, and turn. An hour later, a flatbed tow truck rumbled to a stop outside my bay, the pristine pearl-white Ethereum looking like a fallen angel strapped to its back. Helen was in the passenger seat of the tow truck, her face pale but set. She climbed out, just as a sleek black company sedan pulled in behind them, tires screeching. A man in an impossibly sharp suit emerged. Mr. Sterling, I presumed. His face was a mask of professional concern, but his eyes were hard. scanning my garage with undisguised contempt. "Mrs. Markham, please," he said, his voice slick as Teflon. "This is highly irregular and potentially voids your warranty. This facility is not equipped to handle the proprietary technology in your vehicle. To remove the vehicle now is to assume all liability. We cannot be responsible for any subsequent failures. You're making a terrible mistake." His eyes flicked to me. "Listening to amateur advice. The only mistake being made here," I said, my voice low and carrying in the quiet garage, "was thinking you could hide a faulty primary sensor fusion array and not have someone find it." He'd expected me to talk about funny noises or a check engine light. His whole strategy was built on a foundation of our ignorance. How did you—" he stammered, his professional veneer cracking. I didn't answer. I just looked at him, letting the weight of that knowledge hang in the oily air between us. The game was over. He knew it. The frantic call he was about to make, the cover-up he would try to initiate, it was all just noise now. The real machinery was already in motion. Sal's tip was the spark, and Sterling's panicked reaction would be the fuel. I turned my back on him, a deliberate and final insult, and walked toward the Ethereum. The key wasn't in my hand to start it. It was in my pocket, a cold, hard promise. The time for diagnosis was over. Now, the autopsy would begin. A week later, I was at their house for a tense, mandatory thank-you dinner. The air in their dining room was thick with the smell of over-roasted chicken and unspoken hostility. My daughter Sarah moved around the table like a ghost, her smiles tight and brittle, not meeting my eyes. This was her husband's victory lap, and I was the captive audience. Mark, smug and triumphant, slid a ridiculously inflated repair bill across the polished mahogany toward me. The paper was crisp, the numbers a bold declaration of war. "This is what a real repair costs, Frank," he said with a smirk that didn't reach his cold eyes. Mr. Finch even oversaw it personally, said it was a miracle the car didn't burst into flames on the highway. A real complex issue with the, what did he call it? The primary sensor fusion array. And that's when I saw it. Sitting on their ornate mail table, propped up against a crystal vase, was a thick, cream-colored envelope with the distinct embossed seal of the State Consumer Protection Agency. My heart beat a steady, heavy rhythm. The moment had arrived. Mark misinterpreted my silence for shame. "Don't worry, we're not expecting you to pay it," he chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Consider it an educational tool, a lesson in knowing your place." He almost got you killed with his backyard diagnosis. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Sterling Motors didn't just fix the car, Frank. They replaced the entire compromised system. It wasn't a simple sensor, it was a core network failure. They showed me the schematics. It's a completely different car now. Safe. They hadn't fixed the Ethereum. They had buried the evidence deeper, swapping out the entire fusion array to destroy the proof. But they'd made a mistake. They'd underestimated the paper trail." "I'm glad it's safe," I said, and I meant it. Sarah didn't deserve to be a pawn in this. The rest of the dinner was a study in quiet agony. We cut the dry chicken, made stilted conversation about the weather, and all the while, that envelope in the hallway pulsed like a silent alarm. I was just pushing my dessert plate away, planning my escape, when the doorbell rang. Sarah jumped. Mark frowned, wiping his mouth with a napkin. Who could that be? "Mark Vancroft?" Her voice was clear and carried easily into the dining room. "Yeah? Who are you?" He would never. I had. Anonymously, but with precise details only an insider, or the original mechanic who'd been silenced, would know. Sal's voice echoed in my memory. A frantic whisper over a bad line. "They're burying it, Frank. The whole array. They're calling it a network failure to void the initial work order." "Vancroft," the mail agent said, his tone flat. "Model X7, VIN ending in 8840. We've received compelling evidence, including internal service bulletins and sworn testimony, suggesting a known critical fault was deliberately concealed. The bill you just received from Sterling Motors is a key part of our investigation into fraudulent repair practices." "Concealed. Vancroft provided to Sterling Motors a week ago is already in your system. It details the primary sensor fusion array failure. It seems they chose to ignore it and create a new, more expensive problem to cover it up. Vancroft, it appears you were overcharged for a repair that addressed a non-existent problem, while the actual dangerous defect was intentionally hidden from you. We're going to need you to come down to the office to make a formal statement. And I just stood there, my hand in my pocket, clutching the key to the Ethereum's data port. The key that had downloaded the truth before Sterling could bury it. The autopsy was complete, and now, the body was testifying. I didn't look at the bill. I looked straight into Mark's eyes, my expression unreadable. You didn't pay for a repair, I said, my voice low and even. You paid them to hide a time bomb. Dad, don't start. It tells the Ethereum where it is in space, where other cars are, when to brake, when to swerve. Yours failed. Catastrophically. The diagnostic report I sent you, the one you took to Sterling Motors, said exactly that. It was a 3-page document. Did you even read it? They couldn't. Not without a full, warranty-covered system replacement that would have cost them a fortune. So they lied. They fabricated a fault in the secondary power relay, a simple, expensive, but ultimately harmless fix. They charged you $4,000 for a new relay and a software patch that did one thing and one thing only. It masked the primary failure. It silenced the error codes and fed the main computer a loop of clean, fake data. Your car's dashboard looks fine, but its brain is blind. It's driving on a hope and a prayer. I pulled it out, holding it between my thumb and forefinger for them to see. It was an unassuming little thing, a sliver of black plastic and gold connectors. This, I said, my voice dropping even further, is how I know. While you two were at the gala last night, I was in your garage. I plugged this into the Ethereum's service port. It downloaded the car's entire operational history, the real one, not the sanitized version Sterling Motors uploaded. It's all there. The initial array failure, the corrupted data streams, and the time-stamped log of their repair that installed the masking protocol. This isn't about you belittling me, Mark. This is about criminal negligence. I sent everything to the state attorney's office this morning. The bill you just received from Sterling Motors is a key part of our investigation into fraudulent repair practices. Frank, tell them! She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. She looked from the bill to Mark's ashen face. Mr. Vancroft, it appears you were overcharged for a repair that addressed a non-existent problem, while the actual dangerous defect was intentionally hidden from you. We're going to need you to come down to the office to make a formal statement. It felt less like a triumph and more like a weight, the truth it had downloaded from the Ethereum's data port, a burden I now had to carry. Mark's denials were a fading echo, Sarah's tears a silent accusation. The autopsy was complete, and the body was testifying, but the verdict now rested squarely in my palm. The male agent guided a shell-shocked Mark toward the door. Sarah didn't move to stop them. She just stood there, a statue of shattered illusions, watching the man who had everything be led away because of the man who had, in her eyes, nothing. As the door closed, the silence in the foyer was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. She finally turned to look at me, her face a mess of tears and confusion. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew this would happen tonight. You set him up." He set himself up the moment he valued his pride over his safety. Over your safety. I took a step toward her, but she flinched back as if I were radioactive. "Don't. Just don't." She wrapped her arms around herself. "You couldn't just be the bigger man. You had to destroy him. The victory I thought I'd feel was ashes in my mouth." "I didn't destroy him, Sarah. I was trying to protect you. That's all I've ever been trying to do." I turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving her standing alone in the grand, silent hallway. The battle was won. The truth was out. But the cost was sitting in my heart, a lead weight. I had proven I was right, and in doing so I had likely lost my daughter for good. The words left my mouth not with a flourish, but with the grim finality of a mechanic stating a diagnosis. There was no pleasure in it, only the hollow clang of a truth too long suppressed. "You should open your mail," I said, nodding toward the envelope. Sarah, Her hands trembling with a residual anger that now had nowhere to go, picked it up. The tear of the paper was a sharp, ugly sound in the suffocating silence. I watched her eyes scan the formal letterhead, the dense legal paragraphs. I didn't need to see the words. I had memorized them. They were a cold, bureaucratic echo of the storm I had just unleashed. Her face, already a canvas of shock, went a shade paler, the blood draining away as if pulled by the gravity of the situation. The paper fluttered slightly in her grasp. Mark, who had been hovering like a ghost, took a hesitant step closer. "What is it, Sarah?" He read it, his lips moving silently, and then his head snapped up, his gaze a volatile mix of confusion and dawning horror. "Evidence? A felony fraud investigation? This is insane." I laid it out for them like a schematic. I described the timing chain, not as a mere car part, but as the heart's metronome, the precise coordinator of the engine's dance. I explained the specific metallurgical flaw, a weakness born from a cost-cutting alloy, a tiny fracture waiting to propagate. I detailed how, under the stress of normal acceleration, that chain would stretch, then jump a tooth, and then, catastrophically, snap. "The engine isn't an interference engine," I stated, watching Mark's face closely. "It's a destructive interference engine. When that chain goes, the pistons and valves don't just stop, they meet. It's a metal-on-metal collision at thousands of revolutions per minute. It doesn't stall, Mark. It detonates, it seizes solid, locking the wheels at whatever speed you're traveling. It turns your luxury SUV into a 2-ton bullet with no steering and no brakes." Instead, they performed a superficial reset, tightening a tensioner, clearing the fault codes, wiping the engine's memory of its own impending failure. It was a digital band-aid on a hemorrhaging artery, a trick to get the vehicle just past the warranty expiration, to shift the liability and the bill from Prestige Motors onto the shoulders of the unsuspecting owner. "The data port," I said, my hand instinctively touching my pocket, where the key now felt like a lead weight. It recorded the initial fault. It also recorded the dealership's reset. It remembers everything. Sterling wasn't just selling you a defective car. He was actively erasing the evidence of its defect, sending you back onto the highway with a timed bomb. I told them how Sterling had tried to buy his silence, then threatened his livelihood, and how Sal, with nothing left to lose, had come to me. I described the slow, meticulous build of our case, the quiet gathering of evidence while Sterling preened and Mark boasted. And tonight, I finished, my gaze settling on Sarah, who was now looking at me, her expression unreadable. "You drove that repaired vehicle right into the heart of the investigation. You were the final, perfect piece of evidence. The plaintiffs who were too scared to come forward, the data logs we'd compiled. It was all circumstantial, without the physical proof, without the very vehicle being presented to the right people at the right time. You walked into the trap Sterling set for himself. Your pride in his gift was the bait, and his arrogance was the spring." Mark looked physically ill, his hand gripping the back of the sofa for support. He wasn't a titan of industry anymore. He was a man who had been tricked into risking his life, and the life of the woman he loved, for the sake of a logo on a grill. Sarah finally spoke, her voice a ragged whisper. "All this time, you were just building this?" It just happened to have a human face. But as I stood at the sink, staring out into the dark, empty backyard, all I could feel was the profound emptiness of the workshop after the complex, broken machine has finally been fixed, leaving behind only the silence and the scattered, useless parts. Mark stared at me, his jaw slack. The entire architecture of his superiority crumbled in an instant. The car, his ultimate status symbol, was a worthless, dangerous liability. The man he'd mocked, Alistair Finch, was a crook who had played him for a fool. And the father-in-law he'd dismissed as a greasy relic was the only one who had seen the truth. My practical knowledge, born from a lifetime in a dirty jumpsuit, had unraveled his entire world. The checkmate was silent, absolute, and undeniable. I watched the collapse from across the room, a silent witness to an implosion. It wasn't a victory march I felt, but the grim finality of a demolition expert watching a condemned building fold in on itself, exactly as planned. Leaving only dust and a vacant lot, his face went through a series of rapid, failed adjustments. A twitch of denial, a spasm of rage, a hollowing of utter confusion, before settling on a pale, waxen stillness. The hand that had been gripping the sofa for support now seemed to be the only thing holding him upright. Sarah was the one who broke. A small choked sound escaped her, a sob that was also a laugh, a horrible guttural thing, a liability. She whispered, the words frayed. "You mean it could have, with me in it, with the kids?" The danger had not been an abstract concept of financial ruin or legal trouble. It had been the subtle shudder in the steering wheel on the highway, the faint acrid smell she'd once blamed on the city air, the way the brakes had felt just a little soft that afternoon she'd taken our granddaughter to the park. It had been real, and it had been in the garage, nestled beside their children's bicycles. "I told you," she said, her voice gaining a shred of steel as she turned on Mark. "I told you there was a noise, a rattle. You said it was character. You said it was the sound of raw power." The mimicry was vicious, a perfect, damning echo of his own pretensions. Mark flinched as if she'd struck him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The titan of industry had been reduced to a man who had gambled with his family's safety for the sake of a brand name, and he had lost before he even knew he was playing. His pride, that gleaming, impenetrable armor, was now just shrapnel embedded in his own skin. I turned my back on them then, the spectacle becoming too intimate, too ugly. I walked the familiar path back to the kitchen, my sanctuary of grease and gasoline, now feeling as alien as a showroom floor. The victory was complete. Sterling was finished, but the taste in my mouth was of ashes and engine coolant. I had fixed the most dangerous machine I'd ever encountered, just as I'd said. But a machine is clean. It has wires and circuits, pistons and seals. You drain the bad fluid, replace the faulty part, torque the bolts to the proper specification. It either works or it doesn't. This was different. I had used a human being as a wrench. I had used my own daughter's husband as a blunt instrument. I had manipulated his vanity, stoked his pride in that death trap on wheels, and pointed him right at the cliff. Sure, I'd calculated the odds, I'd built the safety net of the investigation, but he'd still been the one to drive over the edge. And Sarah had been in the passenger seat. I stood at the sink, bracing myself against the cool porcelain, and stared out into the dark, empty backyard. The swing set my hands had built for the grandkids was a skeletal silhouette against the neighbor's fence. This was the profound emptiness I'd dreaded. The complex, broken machine was fixed. Sterling Company would be dismantled, the lawsuits would bury him, the public would be warned. The job was done, but the workshop was a mess. The scattered, useless parts weren't just metal. They were the shattered trust between my daughter and her husband. The look of betrayed awe in her eyes when she realized her father was a strategist, a puppeteer, and not just a kindly old mechanic. They were the memory of Mark's face, not as an arrogant fool, but as a broken man realizing the depth of his own gullibility. I heard a movement behind me. I didn't turn. I knew the sound of Sarah's footsteps. She stopped a few feet away, the silence between us a new, heavy thing. "All those late nights," she said, her voice quiet, stripped of its earlier hysteria. "You said you were fine-tuning. You were planting evidence." The car was the evidence. I just made sure it would present itself. The data logger was my insurance. His own systems would betray him. He would have gone straight to Sterling, warned him, and the whole thing would have collapsed. More people would have gotten hurt. Or you would have had to look at your husband every day, knowing what he was driving, knowing what I knew, and living a lie with him. That was a burden I wouldn't give you. She absorbed this, her gaze drifting over to the living room where Mark still stood, a statue in his own ruin. "What happens now?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between us, as heavy and complicated as the car sitting in their garage. I had an answer for that too. I had a plan for the legal fallout, for the reporters who would inevitably call, for the process of untangling themselves from Sterling's mess. But as I looked at my daughter's lost expression, I knew that was the easy part. The hard part, the real repair job, was just beginning, and I had no blueprint, no service manual, for putting a family back together. The silence in the wake of my confession was a physical thing, a dense fog that filled the space between my daughter and me. I watched the aftermath from a distance, a spectator in the house I had helped fracture. The official gears began to turn with a grinding, impersonal efficiency. The data logger, my little piece of digital insurance, became the star witness. The investigation led to a massive recall and a class action lawsuit that bankrupted Alistair Finch. Mark and Sarah were forced to give depositions, their names dragged into the local news story about the dealership's fraud. I saw a clip on the evening news, a 3-second shot of them hurrying from a courthouse, Mark's arm thrown up to block the camera, Sarah's face a pale, stunned mask. Their perfect, curated image was shattered, and I felt a grim, ugly satisfaction at the sight, followed immediately by a wave of shame. The car, that sleek silver monument to their aspirations, sat in an evidence locker for months, a constant, silent reminder of their pride and their folly. They had been humbled not by a loss of money, but by the irrefutable proof of their own ignorance. That, I knew, was the wound that festered. Mark moved out 2 weeks after the news broke. It wasn't a dramatic, door-slamming exit. It was a quiet, logistical unraveling. He took a small apartment on the other side of town, and the house seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding for years. The absence of his tension was a palpable relief, but it was replaced by a different kind of emptiness, a void where a family used to be. Sarah drifted through the rooms like a ghost. She stopped arranging the decorative pillows on the couch. The mail piled up on the counter unopened. I'd come over with groceries, milk, bread, the kind of things you forget to buy when your life is falling apart, and find her sitting at the kitchen island, staring at the blank screen of her phone. I tried to bridge the gap. "The lawn needs mowing," I'd say, or "I can fix that leaky faucet in the guest bath." Mundane offers, lifelines thrown into still water. She'd just nod. "Okay, Dad. Thanks." The oil stain was still there, a dark Rorschach blot on the concrete. "They released it," she said without turning around. "The car. It's sitting in a tow yard. I have to decide what to do with it. They said I could sell it for parts. Part of the asset division. Our lawyers are talking." She shook her head. "Our lawyers. I never thought I'd have one of those, let alone need one to talk to my own husband. You walked me down the aisle and gave me away to a man you already knew was... what? Corrupt? Complicit? You stood there and smiled for the pictures. You would have chosen him anyway, and I would have lost you. The scalpel I had wielded with such precision had finally cut me too. I left her in the garage and went into the house, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I wandered into the living room, my eyes falling on the grand piano. It was spotless, untouched. I lifted the fallboard and stared at the silent keys. I remembered teaching her her first scale on a much smaller, scuffed-up upright, her small fingers stubbornly pressing down. "Again," I'd say, and she'd sigh. But she'd do it. On the music rest was a single framed photograph from their wedding day. They were dancing, her head thrown back in a laugh, his hand resting on the small of her back. They looked invincible. I picked up the frame, my thumb smudging the glass over his smiling face. The rage I felt toward him was a cold, steady flame. He had offered her a fantasy, and I had destroyed it. But had I destroyed the fantasy to save her, or to prove I was right? I heard her footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around, just kept staring at the photo. "I'm not going to get rid of it," she said, her voice closer now. "The photo, all of it. The scent of gasoline and old metal was my incense, the rhythmic scraping of a gasket cleaner my meditation. In here, things made sense. A problem had a cause had a fix. There was no ambiguity, no cold flame of rage to manage, only the tangible satisfaction of a part cleaned, adjusted, and restored to its purpose. The world outside was a blur of Sarah's slow, painful reconstruction, the sale of the house, the quiet legal disentanglement, the first tentative sessions with a therapist. But in here, the universe was reduced to this single greasy component in my hands. The door creaked open, a sliver of afternoon light cutting across the dusty floor. Sarah stood there, holding Leo by the hand. She didn't say anything at first, just watched me work, her silhouette framed by the doorway. Leo, however, was mesmerized, his small body straining against his mother's grip, drawn to the glittering tools and mysterious shapes. "Grandpa, what's that?" he asked, pointing with a small, earnest finger. The sound of his voice, the title he used so freely, still sent a small, grateful shock through my system. I smiled, setting the carburetor body down. "This, my boy," I said, lifting him onto the cleared corner of the workbench, "is a heart. It mixes the air and the fuel. It helps the engine breathe." His eyes widened as I showed him the float chamber, the tiny needle valve. He was at that perfect age where wonder trumped all other emotions. Sarah stepped forward then, out of the doorway's shadow and into the soft glow of the gooseneck lamp. The harsh, defensive lines that had been carved into her face for months had softened. The shame I'd seen the night of the crash was gone, not forgotten, but metabolized into something else. In its place was a quiet respect, a weary acknowledgement of the complicated, flawed love that had shattered her world, only to help her pick up the pieces. Her eyes found mine, and they were clear. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but steady, no longer frayed at the edges. "Next time a car makes a funny noise, can you teach me what to listen for?" It was about wanting to understand the machinery of her own life, to diagnose the knocks and pings before they became catastrophic failures. She wasn't asking me to fix it for her, she was asking me to show her how to fix it herself. I stopped my work, my hands pausing in their methodical task. I looked at her, really looked at her, standing in my sanctuary, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 repairs. This was the daughter I'd taught to ride a bike, to parallel park, to appreciate the simple geometry of a well-executed dovetail joint. This was also the woman from whom I'd stolen a carefully constructed happiness, even if it was built on a foundation of lies. The memory of that wedding photo, face down on the piano, flashed in my mind. We had indeed begun. My gaze fell to my hands, stained with grime and oil, the permanent lines of my fingerprints etched with the evidence of my work. They were the hands that had torn apart her marriage. They were the hands that had held her as she sobbed. They were the hands that had just been explaining the function of a carburetor to her son. They were not clean hands. They would never be clean. But in that moment, holding the weight of her request, they felt useful. They felt capable of building something, not just dismantling. I picked up a clean rag from the bench, a soft, white flag of truce amidst the chaos of tools and parts. I held it out to her. It was an offering, an invitation into my world, a silent promise that I would teach her everything I knew. My hands were still greasy, the stains a testament to a lifetime of getting them dirty, of delving into the gritty, messy, necessary work of making broken things run again. But for the first time in a long time, as she reached out and took the cloth from me, her fingers brushing mine, they felt clean, not innocent, but absolved, ready for the next repair.